with the car actually rolling on its own now. Hello and welcome back to Ride Rescue. In this episode I will go over the plan now on getting the whole drivetrain up and going now that the body is back on the chassis and all the drivetrain is in place. Everything in the chassis has been rebuilt. You can go back through some of my prior videos and I can show you how I walk through reinforcing the body, rebuilding the chassis, putting in all new suspension and drivetrain. Now that the body is back on the chassis, in this episode I will go through everything about the engine and transmission and putting all the front pieces back on the car in order to get it drivable and running. Drivable, I mean not literally get in it and drive it down the street, but be able to move it around in the garage and even get it out on a sunny day and work on it. That will be getting in the core support, the radiator, hooking up the transmission lines, getting everything set up so that I can fill it up with oil, fill it up with radiator fluid, fill up the transmission, and actually start this thing up and be able to have it move around on its own power. I'll temporarily set up the air suspension system so that I'll be able to air it up and get it up off the ground and be able to move the car around in the shop and in the garage and out in my driveway to work on. So to back up just a little bit, when I first bought this car, I didn't know a whole lot about the drivetrain. The guy that I bought the car from, he claimed it had a Fireball motor in it. It wasn't. It's a 355 Wildcat. The 355 Wildcat is actually the torque rating. It's a 300 small block. This particular engine came factory rated at 250 horsepower, has a cast iron block with aluminum heads, aluminum intake. It's a pretty unique little motor. Buick only made it for 1 year, 11-to-1 compression with these aluminum heads. It doesn't take a lot of massaging to really bump the horsepower and torque rating up. It's pretty respectable. I can get this engine up over 300 horsepower, probably fairly easily get it over 400 foot-pounds of torque just by porting and aligning the intake manifold to the heads, cleaning up the heads and the ports going into the exhaust manifolds, cleaning those up, swapping over from the cast iron manifold, exhaust manifolds over to the little stubby headers, and then by wrapping the headers, getting the airflow to flow better, dual exhaust, a good size diameter pipe. So there's a lot of great things that I can do to this drivetrain that will make it pretty respectable. I think it could be every bit as good as any of the LS motors that I could get for an inexpensive from a wrecking yard or a small block Chevy swap. Yeah, the Buick motor is harder to get parts for, but I was able to find everything, camshaft, completely rebuild this motor. When I bought it, the previous owner had a receipt for when that engine had been rebuilt. Whoever rebuilt it did not do a very good job, or they lied about what they did. There was a lot of heavy wear and tear on the upper end of the motor. The lower end of the engine had been all redone, but the upper end, the camshaft, the rockers, all of that needed to be replaced again. The stock transmission in this car is a ST300. It's a switch pitch automatic transmission. The switch pitch had a variable pitch torque converter. It didn't really function the way Buick had hoped. They only carried it for 3 years and then dropped it. I plan on putting in an overdrive transmission. The 204R that Buick used in the mid-80s is a great transmission. It was weak in its standard stock form, but with a little bit of tweaking, it can handle some pretty serious horsepower. Look at the Grand Nationals. They're raising the front end off the ground in this transmission with the right modifications, and they're not blowing it up. So it should serve me very well in this little car, the way I'm planning on using it. When I installed this engine and transmission back into the chassis, everything was all cleaned up, everything shiny and pretty. I put a Holley 4DI fuel injection system on it. The fuel injection systems that they have out now are phenomenal. They're a wonderful setup. 4DI that I found, I got it for $400. It sounded like a steal compared to what a lot of them are going for. I mean, you can pay upwards of $2,500 for an electronic fuel injection system like this. but I found out it is just plagued with problems. I'm sure that's why I ended up getting it so cheap. Very difficult to tune. I put it on a laptop, I changed all the maps, I changed all the sensors, I did all kinds of adjustments. I was able to get this car running absolutely fantastic in the winter when it was cold. Come spring, when things started to warm up and dry out, it wouldn't run. It just kept flooding. So I had to go back in with the computer and tune everything, and it took me hours and hours and hours to adjust it so that it would run. And the warmer air, the warmer conditions, and the drier air, the weather turned bad a few weeks later, like it usually does early spring, and the car wouldn't run again. So I spent another several hours trying to adjust it. It was so frustrating. It was so time consuming. I gave up. I ended up buying a Summit Racing 4-barrel carburetor to put back on it. That tuned up really nice. It was very easy to adjust, and the car ran fantastic. So I didn't see any reason to go spending more money and all the wiring involved in the electronic ignition and the electronic carburetor. The wiring, the harness that I had to build for that carburetor, and I switched over to a electronic ignition system, just replacing the points and condenser inside distributor, replaced the coil. Fairly inexpensive, fairly easy to do, but all the wiring that I had to change in order to make all that, I spent hours and hours rewiring and building a huge harness that would go to the computer system. I put the computer system behind the dash in the Buick. I was really proud of all the work that went into this, and I had to pull it all out and restore all the original wiring back. It was just a nightmare. So I learned a valuable lesson on that. Spend the money, get something that's turnkey, or just stay with the old school, old style carburetor system. And that's what I've got on it now. Going back to one of the prior videos, I talked about rebuilding this little engine and putting Range Rover valve covers and Range Rover headers on it. I had to modify the headers a little bit to get them to fit on the driver's side. The valve covers I painted and sanded. They were aluminum, so when I sanded the fins on the top, it gave it a really nice look. The Range Rover used the same heads, so these are 99 valve covers and 99 headers. Works great on a 64, it's kind of funny. The headers I wrapped for two reasons. One, I wanted to keep the engine bay cooler. A cooler engine does have better horsepower. They run better, they run smoother. I also like the look. I really like the look of the wrapped header, and it just really cleaned up to give that show quality finish that I wanted in the engine bay. The firewall, just before I was putting the body back on the chassis behind that brand new shiny motor, I was looking at the firewall going, oh man, there's holes in there I don't need. There's holes that have been drilled for guys that had put in gauges, and there's little divots and pits where at General Motors at the factory, they left little pits here and there that they could drill out to put different accessories. I'm pretty sure this firewall is used on Oldsmobiles and Pontiacs, so there's different accessories that went with those cars. So I just wanted to clean it all up. So I smoothed the whole firewall, and I welded over all the holes that weren't necessary, and really made a nice smooth finish. I kept the original seam. There's kind of a V-shaped seam that goes across the firewall that has some body sealant in that seam. I kept that. I like that look. I could have gone the extra mile and filled all that, but I decided to keep some of that original look, but just smooth it all so that it had a really nice finish. The core support where the radiator mounts, the top of that core support had a lot of holes in it. It had some bolts and studs that were welded on there. Who knows why? Again, it's probably the Oldsmobile or Pontiac, or maybe some different accessories for the Buick. So I cleaned all that up too, so the core support is all smooth. You can see the radiator fan shroud. that I believe was painted black from the factory. It was a fiberglass piece. But when I was sanding it and cleaning it up and getting it ready, it just had a really neat look when I was wet sanding it. So I clear coated it. When I clear coated it, that texture and the fibers of that fiberglass, it looked fantastic. It's a really neat look that just was unexpected and shows really well in that engine bay. I refinished all the parts, all the accessories, everything that hangs on the motor, everything that goes inside the engine bay, all the aluminum parts on the engine I bead blasted and smoothed and then clear coated so they have that natural aluminum look. The brake booster and the master cylinder I did upgrade. It's the same look of the power brake booster, but I went to a 67 Chevelle style master cylinder. It's a lot safer. It has 2 ports on it instead of 1. And I also added a new proportioning valve that separates the pressure from the front to the rear when it comes to the 4-wheel disc brakes. They have a proportioning valve for disc brakes and drum brakes, and one that is for drum and drum, and this particular one is made specifically for 4-wheel disc brakes. So that should really help in keeping the car balanced in a hard stop. So I finished up all the brake lines. The brake lines that I had when I did the chassis were just long extra pieces of tubing that I left so that I could go back and finish bending and aligning up to the modifications with the brake system. I redid the new lines that went underneath the engine, and the new line that went from there's a little transition block that separates for both front brakes, that then goes up to the proportioning valve. So those are all new and tidy and shiny new. All those parts I clear coated so that they'll stay looking new and they'll stay with that fresh metal look. I didn't want to paint them, or some guys will paint them black, or they'll just black bomb the whole engine bay. I wanted to have just some nice details of everything new and fresh, and not just have everything all the same color. One of the things that I wasted a lot of time, a lot of hours on, was when I did the fuel injection system, I had to run all new fuel lines to the car. I had put in a brand new fuel line from the back of the car to the front of the car with a 3/8 line and a 1/4 inch line. Fortunately, the fuel lines that I put in when I redid the chassis will work with the fuel injection system that I was putting on. I did put a Holley electric fuel pump at the gas tank, right above the gas tank, mounted at the rear end of the differential, and wired that all up. And then at the engine bay, where the fuel line would have normally came out next to the fuel pump down by the side of the block, I had to run new lines up and over and around the back of the motor and to the other side of the carburetor, and there's a pressure gauge there, so I wanted to be able to check that when it came to making sure I was getting adequate flow and adequate pressure to make all the system work correctly. Like I say, it ended up being a waste of time. In the end, I ended up going back to the 4-barrel carburetor. I ended up taking the electric fuel pump out of the back by the gas tank and restoring that back to the way the factory would have done it. Put a regular fuel pump on the side of the block. And just really simplified the way the whole fuel system worked again. You can also see in these pictures that the dual exhaust that I bought for the car, I got a Flowmaster exhaust system, and it was a fairly large diameter tube. You can get an X pipe. I ended up going with the H pipe on this just because of the way it's set into the frame. The X pipe hung down just a little bit lower, and with this being on airbags, it would actually drag on the ground. This system I was able to tuck right up into the belly of the car so that when it was all the way down on the bump stops and the frame is just barely off the ground, there was plenty of clearance for all the exhaust system too. So I wouldn't have to worry about dragging the exhaust on a speed bump or over a curb or anything that way. But you can see in the image, the exhaust system, I had to drill a hole in, weld on a bung to put in a O2 sensor. I put O2 sensors on both sides, set everything up the way that it was required for the fuel injection system. But since that didn't work out, after all the work of doing that, I ended up just plugging those holes. While I was putting all of the dual exhaust system together, and under the car, out of the car, under the car, out of the car, because I'm trying to make it perfect. Again, this is a show car. I want it to really look good when somebody climbs underneath the car or looks under there with a flashlight or a judge. They see perfection. So getting everything all set up, finally putting it in for the last time, I broke a stud off in one of the headers. Just my luck. The last time I go to put it in, and one of them just locked up. I mean, it froze up, it broke off, and I had to go through a lot of work to replace that stud. But while I was at it, I put in new nuts and mounted it for the last time. In order to be able to move it around and still be able to work on the tail end of the car, doing the bumper, doing the exhaust up over the rear end, and then fitting it up into the bumper like I was planning. I put the exhaust in originally without the tailpipes. The exhaust stopped right at the end of the muffler, so it had a nice sound to it. It sounded great as I was starting it up and moving it around the shop. The original gas tank in this car had some dings and dents in it. Fortunately, you can get a brand new gas tank for it, so this does have a new tank. Planning on tucking the bumper really tight to the body, I wanted to do the same thing with the exhaust. Again, my car sits on the ground, and I don't want to be worrying about dragging a tailpipe going through a gutter, so I wanted to tuck the pipes in. But at the same time, I wanted a look. I wanted a higher end look that was different than a lot of what was being done in the 60s. A lot of the newer cars have the really large opening on the tailpipes. I found a set of tips that are stainless steel, that are double wall thickness, and the way they were flared and they were made, it just had a great look to it. But they were down too far. I was just going to end up dragging them. So I cut a little half circle into the bottom corners of the back bumper and just kept playing with exactly where I wanted those, and was able to make it so that it lined up with the frame rails. I could mount them to the sides of the frame and mount them to the bumper so that they wouldn't rattle and they wouldn't bang on the back bumper, and then had that custom look that looked like it may have been done that way from the factory. These large diameter pipes coming out through the bottom edge of the bumper really look nice. And lastly, on this engine bay, I wanted to restore the original AC system. All the parts were there, all the hoses were there, all the hoses were in great shape. Put them on a pressure tester, we tested all the hoses, they were all good, there was no cracks. They held the pressure. I put all new seals in it. The pump was frozen up, so I had the pump completely rebuilt and restored, so it was a factory original pump. Looking back on it, I wouldn't do it again. There was so much work involved, and there was so much expense involved in reworking all the original system. Since the car is going to be custom, I would have been better off buying an aftermarket setup like a Vintage Air. For the amount of money that I spent on restoring this one, the Vintage Air would have been a much better way to go. The Vintage Air doesn't take as much power. It doesn't sap the engine as much as the original does. The engine would run cooler. But for a car of this vintage of this year, it was a very rare option for a Skylark to have air conditioning on a convertible of all things. So yeah, it was a neat idea. It did work. It blew cold air, but it wasn't something that on a really, really hot day when you wanted to put up the top and roll up the windows and turn on the air conditioning, it only worked for a few miles and the hot light came on the dash. So like I say, it was a neat feature, but I wouldn't do it again. With the car actually rolling on its own now, running, moving around, lot drives, now we get down to what did it cost me to get to this point. So just kind of a miscellaneous rundown of what I bought. The air conditioning system, new gas tank, new carburetor, all the miscellaneous odds and ends, hoses, lines, clamps, everything that it took to get the motor running. All those parts totaled up to $2,500. So not too bad for this video compared to some of my other ones. My past videos, I have a total of $14,000 into the car, including what I paid for the car. That brings my grand total of cash outlay to $16,500. It's getting up there. I know it's starting to worry my wife. It's time for me to find another project that I can do a quick flip and bring some cash back in, because I am draining my savings account. My wife does jokingly call the Buick my mistress because I spend so much time with her. But at least she knows where I am. I'm just in the garage. Yeah, I'm spending a lot of time on the car. It's a lot more work. The hours are racking up pretty quick. Speaking of hours, in this video I racked up a total of 93 hours. 93 hours at $55 an hour is roughly $5,000 more in labor. Combined with the $23,860 in labor that I had in the car prior to this video, that makes it $28,000 now in labor, $16,500 in actual cash outlay. So that brings me to a grand total of over $45,000 into this car if I would have just taken it to a shop and said, this is what I want done. So yeah, the car's not even halfway finished yet, so this could very well end up being the most expensive Buick Skylark on the planet by the time I'm finished with it. But like I said in the other videos, this is a labor of love. This is something I wanted to do. This is a kind of a car I've always wanted to build. It is going to be a really nice show car, something to be proud of, something to really enjoy and go out and drive. So I'm looking forward to getting this finished. And I'm still well below what the value of this car will be when it's finished. The prices of these classic cars are starting to edge up now. At this point in the time of the car, the price is starting to get up over $20,000, in the mid $20,000 range. I can see it pushing $30,000 soon. Hopefully I'll be able to stay below that mark, so that at least in the end, someday if I decide to sell it, I can get all the money back. So thank you for watching this episode of Ride Revival. Appreciate any support you can give me. Share, subscribe, like. Really appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.